Sharon Jennifer's husband.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming together to immerse ourselves in wisdom of what is written before us and the wisdom of those who are gathered here together in collaborative conversation. We are in Parshat Chukat, which is in the book of Numbers, starting with chapter 19. If you have a copy of the text, I invite you to bring it out at this time. What we'll do is, in just a moment, we will say our blessing for the opportunity of this moment, and then we will read an English translation of our entire Torah portion for the week. I'll share with you a little bit of a focus study for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for our collective conversation. So if you'd like to go ahead and unmute at this time, we can collectively and say our blessing for studying Torah.
Margaret?
Baruch atah
Adonai,
Eloheinu melech
haolam,
asher
tishanu b'mitzvotav,
Tzivanu
anu b'asok b'divrei Torah.
Thank you, God, for the opportunity to immerse ourselves in words, deeds, and relationships of Torah. If you'd like to go ahead and go back on mute, I'll begin reading, and then I'll invite people to have an opportunity to read some verses if you'd like to, and then we'll have our study session. So this is Book of Numbers, chapter 19, verse 1. Adonai spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "This is the ritual law that Adonai has commanded. Instruct the Israelite people to bring you a red heifer without blemish, in which there is no defect, and on which no yoke has been laid. You shall give it to Eleazar the priest. It shall be taken outside the camp and slaughtered in his presence." Richard, would you like to read a little bit, starting at verse 4?
Yes, Rabbi, thank you. Eleazar, the priest, shall take some of its blood with his finger and sprinkle it 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. The cow shall be burned in his sight. Its hide, flesh, and blood shall be burned, its dung included, and the priest shall take cedar wood, hyssop, and crimson yarn, and throw them into the fire, consuming the cow. The priest shall wash his garments and bathe his body in water. After that, the priest may re-enter the camp, but he shall be unclean until evening. He who performed the burning shall also wash his garments in water, bathe his body in water, and be unclean until evening. A man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the cow and deposit them outside the camp in a clean place, to be kept for water of lustration for the Israelite community. It is for cleansing. He who gathers up the ashes of the cow shall also wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. It shall be a permanent law for the Israelites and for the strangers who reside among you.
Thank you, Richard. And June, would you like to unmute and share with us some verses starting at verse 11?
Sure. Thank you, Rabbi. He who touches the corpse of any human being shall be unclean for 7 days. He shall cleanse himself with it on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, and then be clean. If he fails to cleanse himself on the 3rd and 7th days, he shall not be clean. Whoever touches a corpse, the body of a person who has died, and does not cleanse himself, defiles the Lord's tabernacle. That person shall be cut off from Israel. Since the water of lustration was not dashed on him, he remains unclean. His uncleanness is still upon him.
Thank you, Jude. Let me invite Margot. Would you like to read a little bit starting at verse 14?
Thank you. This is the ritual. When a person dies in a tent, whoever enters the tent and whoever is in the tent shall be unclean 7 days, and every open vessel with no lid fastened down shall be unclean. And in the open, anyone who touches a person who was killed or who died naturally, or human bone or a grave, shall be unclean 7 days. Some of the ashes from the fire of cleansing shall be taken for the unclean person, and fresh water shall be added to them in a vessel. A person who is clean shall take hashpot, a dip in the water, and sprinkle on the tent and on all the vessels and people who were there, or on him who touched the bones of the person who was killed or died naturally, or the grave. The clean person shall sprinkle it upon the unclean person on the third day, and on the seventh day, thus cleansing himself by the seventh day. He shall then wash his clothes and bathe in water, and at nightfall he shall be clean. If anyone who has become unclean fails to cleanse himself, that person shall be cut off from the congregation, for he has defiled the Lord, the Lord's sanctuary. The water of illustration was not dashed on him. He is unclean.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And Dave, would you like to start reading at verse 21 and then continue some verses into the start of chapter 20?
Okay. That shall be for them a law for all time. Further, the one who sprinkled the water of lustration shall wash those clothes, and whoever touches the water of lustration shall be impure until evening. Whatever that person touches shall be impure, and the person who touches the impure one shall be impure until evening. The Israelites arrived in a body at the wilderness of Zin on the first new moon, and the people stayed at Kadesh. Miriam died there and was buried there. The community was without water, and they joined against Moses and Aaron. The people quarreled with Moses, saying, "If only we had perished when our brothers perished at the instance of Adonai. Why have you brought Adonai's congregation into this wilderness for us and our beasts to die there? Why did you make us leave Egypt to bring us to this wretched place, a place with no grain or figs or vines or pomegranates? There is not even water to drink."
Thank you so much, Dave. And then Robin, would you like to read a little bit starting in verse 6?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. Moses and Aaron came away from the congregation to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. The presence of Adonai appeared to them, and Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "You and your brother Aaron take the rod and assemble the community, and before their very eyes order the rock to yield its water. Thus you shall produce water for them from the rock and provide drink for the congregation and their beasts." Moses took the rod from before Adonai as he had been commanded. Moses and Aaron assembled the congregation in front of the rock, and he said to them, "Listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock?" And Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. Out came copious water, and the community and their beasts drank.
Thank you so much. And Jim, let me invite you to read if you'd like, starting at verse 12.
Thank you, Rabbi. But Adonai said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelite people, therefore you shall not lead this congregation into the land that I have given them. Those are the waters of Meribah," meaning that the Israelites quarreled with Adonai, through which he affirmed his sanctity. From Kadesh, Moses sent messages to the king of Edom. "Thus says your brother Israel, you know all the hardships that have befallen us, that our ancestors went down to Egypt, that we dwelt in Egypt a long time, and that the Egyptians dealt harshly with us and our ancestors. We cried to Adonai, and he heard our plea, and he sent a messenger who freed us from Egypt. Now we are in Kadesh, the town on the border of your territory. Allow us then to cross your country. We will not pass through fields or vineyards, and we will not drink water from wells, We will follow the king's highway, turning off neither to the right nor to the left until we have crossed your territory.
Thank you so much, Kim. And Mark Thompson, would you like to read a little bit starting at verse 18?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. But Edom answered him, "You shall not pass through us, else we will go out against you with the sword. We will keep to the beaten track," the Israelites said to them, "and if we or our cattle drink your water, we will pay for it. We only ask for passage on foot. It is but a small matter." But they replied, "You shall not pass through." And Edom went out against them in heavy force, strongly armed. So Edom would not let Israel cross their territory, and Israel turned away from them. Setting out from Kadesh, the Israelites arrived in a body at Mount Hor. At Mount Hor, on the boundary of the land of Edom, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Let Aaron be gathered to his kin. He is not to enter the land that I have assigned to the Israelite people, because you disobeyed and my command about the waters of Meribah. Take Aaron and his son Eleazar and bring them up to Mount Hor. Strip Aaron of his vestments and put them on his son Eleazar. There Aaron shall be gathered unto the dead."
Thank you much. And Robert, would you like to read a little bit starting at verse 27?
Yes, thank you. And Moses did as the Lord commanded, and they went up into Mount Hor in the sight of all the congregation. And Moses stripped Aaron of his garments and put them upon Eleazar his son. And Aaron died there in the top of the mount. And Moses and Eleazar came down from the mount. And when all the congregation saw that Aaron was dead, they mourned for Aaron 30 days, even all the house of Israel. And when the king Arad of Canaanite, which dwelt in the south, heard tell that Israel came by way of the spies, then he fought against Israel and took some of them prisoners. And Israel vowed a vow unto the Lord and said, "If thou wilt indeed deliver this people into my hand, then I will utterly destroy their cities." And the Lord hearkened to the voice of Israel and delivered up the Canaanites. And they utterly destroyed them and their cities. And he called the name of the place Hormah. And they
Thank you,
journeyed.
Thank you, Robert, so much. And Kim, would you like to read a little bit starting at verse 4 of chapter 21?
Right. And they journeyed on from Hor, the mountain, by way of the Red Sea to skirt around the land of Edom. And the people grew impatient on the way. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. "Why did you bring us up from Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no bread, there is no water, and we loathe the wretched bread." And the Lord sent against the people the viper serpents, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. And the people came to Moses and said, "We have offended, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he take the serpents away from us." And Moses interceded for the people. And the Lord said to Moses, "Make you a viper and put it on a standard. And so then whoever is bitten will see it and live." And Moses made a serpent of bronze, put it on a standard. So then, if the serpent bit a man, he looked upon the serpent of bronze and lived.
Thank you so much, Kim. Marty, would you like to read a little bit?
Yes.
Thank you.
The Israelites marched on and encamped at Oboth. And they set out from Oboth and encamped at Abarim in the wilderness bordering on Moab to the east. From there they set out and encamped at the Wadi Zered. From there they set out and encamped beyond the Aron, that is, in the wilderness that extends from the territory of the Amorites. For the Aron is the border of Moab, between Moab and the Amorites. Therefore, the book of the wars of the Lord speaks of Wahib in Suphah and the Wadis, and Aron with its tributary wadis, stretched along the settled country of Ar, hugging the territory of Moab. And from there to Beer, which is the well where the Lord said to Moses, assemble the people that I may give them water. Then Israel sang his song. Should I go on?
Please.
Spring up, O well, sing to it, the well which the chieftains dug, which the nobles of the people started, with maces, with their own staffs. And from Midbar to Matana, and from Matana to Naphael, and from Naphael to Bamoth, and from Bamoth to the valley that is in the country of Moab, at the peak of Pisgah, overlooking the wasteland.
Thank you so much, Marty. And now, David and Susan, would you like to take over there at verse 21?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. 21, and Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, saying, let me pass through your land. We will not turn off in field or vineyard. We will not drink well water. On the king's road, we will go until we pass through your territory. And Sihon did not let Israel pass through his territory. And Sihon gathered all his troops and went out to meet Israel in the wilderness. And he came to Jahaz and did battle with Israel. And Israel struck him down by the edge of the sword and seized his land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, to the Ammonites. For the border of the Ammonites was strong. And Israel took all these cities, and Israel settled in all the cities of the Amorite, in Heshbon and in all its surrounding villages. For Heshbon is the city of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and he had done battle with the first king of Moab, and he took all his land from his hand as far as the Arnon.
On account of this, they say proverbially, quote, come to Heshbon, built and founded is Sihon's city. For fire went out of Heshbon, flame from Sihon's town. It consumed Ar of Moab, the lords of the high places of Arnon. Woe unto you, Moab, you perished, Chemosh's people. He's made his sons refugees and his daughters captive to the king of the Amorites, Sihon, and their fiefdom perished, Heshbon to Dibon. And we devastated up to Nophah, which reaches to Medeba, unquote. And Israel lived in the Amorites' land, and Moses sent to spy on Yazer, and they captured its environs and dispossessed the Amorite who was there. And they turned and they went up the road of Bashan, and Og, king of Bashan, went out to them, he and all his people, to war at Edrei.
Thank you so much, David and Susan. I'm going to invite Gary. Would you like to continue and conclude our Torah portion, starting with verse 34?
Thank you, yes. But the Eternal One said to Moses, do not fear him, for I give him and all his troops and his land into your hand. You shall do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon. They defeated him and his sons and all his troops until no remnant was left him, and they took possession of his country. The Israelites then marched on and encamped to the steppes of Moab, across the Jordan from Jericho.
Jericho. Thank you so much, everyone. That's our entire Torah portion for the week. I would like to share with you a little bit of a focus study, and then we'll open it up for our collaborative conversation about this week's Torah portion. If you have a copy of the study sheet, I invite you to take it out now. And I have entitled this week's study session, The Faith of Interpretation. And through this, we're going to explore a little bit about the role of interpretation in Judaism and what's the nature of faith within Judaism. And I begin by looking at something that's kind of a detail of this very climactic scene that happens in this week's Torah portion, where the people are clamoring for water, and God says to Moses, speak to the rock and draw forth water from the rock. And the instruction specifically from God says, and before their very eyes, order the rock to yield its water. And Moses, instead of ordering or speaking to the rock, hits the rock with his staff, and water does indeed come out. But God says, your punishment for not having displayed faith in me is that you're not going to be entering the promised land. And this expression of God saying you didn't trust in me is from chapter 20, verse 12. Because you did not trust, lo he'en man ten. You didn't have faith in me, enough to affirm my sanctity before the eyes of the Israelite people. So I'd like to focus for a moment on this word that's used here for, well, here it's translated as trust, but it really means a more literal translation. You didn't have, well, faith in me. And if number 2 on the study sheet gives us the root word that gives us the verb to have faith in, it's the verb aman, which means to confirm, support, nourish. And then we have the word emunah, which means firmness, steadfastness, fidelity. Sometimes it gets translated as faith. And then interestingly enough, amanah is used in the book of Kings for a river that flows through Damascus. So there's now we're getting this word that has to do with support, nourish, fidelity, also being applied to something that flows. And then we have, built upon the same Hebrew root, the noun aman, which means a master worker or artist. So I want to suggest that within Judaism, there seems to be this nuanced relationship between what gets often translated as faith and something having to do with artistry. It has something to do with creativity. And in my weekly email, I suggested that there are some faith traditions that are based upon doctrine, and followers, adherents of those particular faith traditions are encouraged to learn the doctrine and to be able to recite the doctrine. And that becomes a sign, a confirmation, if you want, affirmation of their steadfastness, of their faith. And I want to suggest that that's not what happens within Judaism. The way we are encouraged to read our text is to read our text not through the eyes of doctrine, but through the eyes of interpretation. And it is that level of interpretation that ultimately produces a sense of faith, because we are expressing our creativity. I want to show how that plays out in this portion that we've just been reading. But I'd like to continue just a little bit more about the notion of interpretation as an act of artistry. So here in number 3, this is from a book called Principles for Interpreting Art by Terry Barrett, who I believe was a professor of art at Ohio State University, or in Ohio, I believe. And in his book, he wrote, "It is a standard characteristic of artworks that they often come with features that are unusual, puzzling, initially mysterious, or disconcerting, or with features whose portents are far from obvious. This is not a problem to be dreaded when facing artworks. Artworks require a tolerance for ambiguity. Since artworks are rarely obvious, they need to be interpreted to be understood. The admissibility of an interpretation is ultimately determined by a community of interpreters, and the community is self-correcting." I want us to take a step back from the art world for a moment and to think about our sacred text, Torah. Because if you recall, Torah opens up with the very description that Terry Barrett has in his piece here. It opens up with words that they're unusual, they're puzzling, they're initially mysterious, and they're disconcerting, and their portents are far from obvious. Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning God created. When we've studied the opening of Torah, Bereshit bara Elohim, we've talked about how Bereshit is linguistically and grammatically, it doesn't make sense grammatically. There's something that's disturbing grammatically about that phrase. And so it is a phrase that begins to, rather than make things clear, it makes things unclear. And instead of providing us with some firm footing about where we are at the beginning of all things, it provides a rather unsteady foundation, a shaky foundation. There's something odd about the language itself, which causes us to wonder, what exactly is going on? What is this Bereshit? What is actually being created? Where do things come from? And what's our role in it? And so rather than, and we've seen this time and time again in Torah, where there are openings and phrases that are ambiguous and puzzling and disconcerting. And in Judaism, we read these less to resolve what the ambiguity is, then it's more of an invitation for us to exercise our powers of interpretation and creativity to begin to try and understand what's going on, to delve into the mystery rather than to try and work out the mystery immediately. Okay, so this is what Terry Barrett is offering up in terms of how to look at a work of art. He says, artworks require a tolerance for ambiguity. And that is what Torah provides us. It provides a lot of ambiguity. The Hebrew language itself, because you can insert different vowels, different vocalizations, and create entirely different meanings. There's no punctuation in the way the Torah scroll is written. How you emphasize, how you choose to insert the capitalizations and the punctuations, the pauses and so on, can radically change the meaning of the text itself. And so this degree of ambiguity requires a participation from the reader in order to draw meaning. And that's what he is saying about the viewer in terms of a visual work of art, that great works of art are not often clear from what they present us. It draws us into the image itself in order to try and exercise our own creativity to extract the meaning from it. You turn over the sheet, I would like to share with you just one more little commentary on the nature of interpretation, and then we'll get back to our text itself. And this is from Jennifer DePrizio, who's the director of interpretation at the Cleveland Art Museum. And in a piece she wrote, we each look at art through the lens of our whole lived experience. And therefore, we each experience a work of art in our own unique way. Interpretation, therefore, invites us to recognize relationships, navigate multiple meanings, invest in looking, and demonstrate curiosity from whatever point of view we have. These last two phrases in particular that she uses, to invest in looking and to demonstrate curiosity. I think this is what the Jewish way of reading sacred text is all about, is to invest ourselves in what is before us, to exercise our curiosity, and not to take things at face value, but to plumb the depths of what's before us. So now let's go back to our Torah text itself. And we have in number 5, a bit of Midrash from Midrash Bamidbar Rabbah. And when it's looking at this verse about the Israelites standing there in front of the rock, and the instructions from God are and I want you to come order the rock before the very eyes of the Israelites. And so this is what the Midrash says. The Midrash says, each person saw himself standing in the presence of the rock. And Aviva Zornberg, one of the great contemporary commentators on Torah, she picks up on this notion from the Midrash and she expands upon it. And she writes, each person sees his or her own presence in the presence of the rock. Looking at the thing, one endows it with a face. Space is created between two faces. One enhances the rock with one's own life. So she's picking up on this midrash from 2,000 years ago, and she's acknowledging that what this ancient bit of wisdom is telling us is that at this moment at the rock, the Israelites are carrying their own individual experience and presence to the rock, and in the rock they're having some kind of relationship with the power that is being drawn there. And here is from a 19th century commentator what that moment was supposed to be all about. This is number 6 on the study sheet, and this is from the commentator Hamek Devar, whose name was Naftali C. Yehuda Berlin. He lived from 1816 to 1893, and he was the head of a yeshiva in Belarus. He was a great Talmudist, great scholar. He says this moment, and the moment at the rock, was to prepare the people for a post-miraculous new period. It was designed as a transition from the miracles and direct intervention of the wilderness to the human work of study, prayer, and decision-making that is part of living in the land of promise. Well, the Hamek Devar is saying what this moment at the rock was supposed to be all about, this visual moment, this moment that was an invitation for each Israelite to have a distinct and unique relationship with this moment of power. They were to draw away from it, this understanding that they were now making a transition from this period that they've been on, where they have been taken care of, they've been provided food, they've been provided water, they've been provided protection. God has intervened on their behalf, and now they're going to have to make a transition. They're going to have to become more independent, more actively engaged, developed human beings. And Moses, if you will, frustrates to an extent that moment. He seeks to, I don't know what his intention was, but he disrupts this moment that was meant to be a moment of empowering the Israelites each with their own unique skills and power. But there's something that's interesting that happens in the flow of the Torah portion. And that is in number 7. We read these verses about the people confronting the Edomites. And here in chapter 20, it says, Moses sent messengers to the king of Edom. But Edom answered him, you shall not pass through us. So Edom would not let Israel cross, and Israel turned away from them. Then in chapter 21, something quite startling happens. Remember, by this point, Miriam has died. Miriam, according to tradition, was the source of being able to have water in the wilderness. And we saw a hint of that in this week's Torah portion when it says Miriam died, and then right after that it says the people were without water. So from that, the commentators draw the connection. The water stopped being available because Miriam died. Miriam was the one who was enabled water to constantly be found. She was the source of water being available. So Miriam dies. So how are they going to get water now? And this is what happens in chapter 21. Israel sang this song, "Spring up, O well, sing to it." The Israelites take on the responsibility of being the draw force of water. They take up where Miriam left off. They now become the power to bring water into their lives. And what happens right after that? Right after that, it says, Israel now sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites. Sihon would not let Israel pass, but Israel put them to the sword. It is almost a complete replication of what happened a chapter earlier with the Edomites. But back in chapter 20, it was Moses who sent messengers to Edom. Edom says, you're not passing through us. And so the Israelites walked away defeated and frustrated. But here, after they've sung this song, after they have expressed this power, after they have taken upon themselves the responsibility of providing sustenance, now it says Israel, instead of Moses, sent messengers to the king of the Amorites. And again, it says the king of this particular tribe wouldn't let Israel pass, but this time Israel put them to the sword. Israel, at least for this moment, they have become powerful. They have surpassed, or at least taken over, where their designated leaders had been. And so this capacity to now be creative through music, through the singing of a song, through the assumption of their responsibility, rather than being merely passive observers of those who are doing for them, they become the doers for their own lives. So if you'd like to take a look at our graphic on the first page. This is a fabric assemblage by an Indian artist, by Shali Oak. And as I mentioned in my email, she was driving by a settlement of nomads in India, and she looked at the beautiful fabrics that they were sewing together. It was a traditional form of Indian fabric work. And she looked at them and saw in them not just the ancient tradition that these nomads were practicing. She saw something of her own artwork in it, her own interest in abstract art. And so she started to create her own assemblages of fabric, which were on the one hand honoring of this ancient tradition, but they were also expressing her unique style, her unique vision of art. And so she has, if you will, honored tradition by reinterpreting this tradition and producing a beautiful work of art. And so I want to suggest, this is what this particular portion is teaching us, is that faith in the Jewish tradition is not about learning doctrine that someone else has constructed for us. Faith in the Jewish tradition is an exercise of our individual imaginative creative powers. And interestingly enough, the quote from Terry Barrett from his book, Principles for Interpreting Art, concludes this last sentence, which is fascinating. The admissibility of an interpretation is ultimately determined by a community of interpreters, and the community is self-correcting. I have never come up or seen a more concise description of what the enterprise called Talmud is all about. In the enterprise of Talmud, great sages are invited encouraged and indeed provoked to exercise their creativity in looking at received tradition verses from Torah, and to understand what and to provide their interpretation of it. But the interpretation ultimately gains, whilst every interpretation is recorded, those that gained approval and ascendancy and endurance is really determined by a community of interpreters. It has to be embraced by a community of interpreters in order for it to really gain traction and effectuation. So we are also a community of interpreters. We are all, each one of us, encouraged to be artists. We're all, each one of us, encouraged not so much to learn some kind of prescribed doctrine. We're encouraged to exercise our facilities of imagination and creation and creativity, and to contribute to the great weaving project that is Judaism. So with that, I'd love to open it up and hear what you encountered along the way of our Torah portion this week. And if you'd like to raise your hand, I'd love to call upon you. Gary. And then Marty. Gary, go first. And then you'll need to unmute.
Thank you. A question and a comment, and I'll make them both brief. But the comment is that I've always been, it's one of the things I love about Judaism is that we are encouraged to interpret so much of the Torah. And of course, it's so much easier to do with a community like this and having a rabbi that's studied that can help us interpret. But I guess my question is that I also, one of the other things I love about Judaism is that there are what I call moral absolutes. And so just taking the top 10 of the 613 commandments, my question is, are those, I've been comforted in thinking that those are not open to interpretation. For instance, thou shalt not murder. We're not allowed to kill and premeditatedly kill an innocent person. That gives me comfort. So I'm assuming that there are some things that are not open for interpretation, and we would learn those by doing what we're doing here, chatting with our community and with a rabbi, or are even the 10 commandments open for interpretation?
So let me ask you this question, Gary. So what would you say is the difference between saying it is wrong to rob from a person and to say the soul endures after death? What's the difference between those two statements?
I'm sorry, I'm at a loss, Rabbi, sorry.
Oh, I apologize for being too opaque. So we are, it's quite clear that as a community, we have standards of behavior.
Yes.
That we bound ourselves to, okay? And we are expected to abide by these standards of behavior. When it comes matters of speculation, when it comes matters of philosophy, when it comes to matters of trying to understand a beautiful work of art or beautiful piece of Torah, to the extent that those are more matters of thought rather than matters of behavior, then we're encouraged to expand as much as possible. You might think of it this way, that when we breathe in, we breathe out, we expand, we contract. And so the contraction you might think of as the ways in which we are we're required to behave in order to have a coherent community that's not in chaos. But what we can expand our breathing when it comes to matters of thought. We even saw that at Mount Sinai when it says, we shall do and we shall hear. And it says, in one case it says, they speak in one voice, and then it doesn't say they speak in one voice. And the rabbis say, when it comes to matters of behavior or ethical behavior, there has to be an agreement about what that is. When it comes to matters of, philosophy, thought, speculation, there doesn't need to be a unanimity about all that. So I think, so perhaps that gets at what you were kind of trying to get us to parse the difference between, we need to all agree that we can't go around killing people, but perhaps we can, speculate about other things and not have to come to an agreement about them. Okay. And Catherine, let me invite you. Oh, Marty, I'm sorry. Let me call Marty first, and then we'll go to Catherine and Mark Thompson. Yes, Marty. Go ahead and unmute, Marty.
Yes. I'm new to your study group. You'll forgive me for being a little psychological, but that's my background. I was very struck by this Parsha, this short little reading, because in a very interesting way, it encapsulates developmental history for people. You start out with two leaders, Aaron and Moses, obviously, who are not only the leaders, but in some ways they're the parental figures. They're the ones that are leading the people and telling them what to do. They show that even the leaders can make mistakes and are imperfect. And ultimately, they don't even get the blessing of the promised land, and neither of them are able to proceed. And the community needs to developmentally mature, take on more responsibility, and act like adults in the absence of the leaders. So it's a very interesting little illustration of like Maslow's stages of development.
Beautifully said. And yes, it shows that even the best among us make mistakes. And as you pointed out, in order to self-actualize as a human being, at some point you can't rely upon people to always have the answers for you. You have to become one of those who comes up with answers and takes responsibility. So thank you very much for that. Beautiful to introduce that. And let me go to Catherine and then Mark Thompson. Go ahead, Catherine.
Yes. On the surface, when we first read this Parshat, we sense that Miriam's death is passed over too lightly on the surface, whereas Aaron is mourned for 30 days. And we also have this long section on cleanliness in relationship to touching dead bodies. And so it's really actually quite profound to think that, to discover that Miriam is actually, that her passing is sort of the passing of kind of an epoch in the life of the community. And that we need to pave the way for Israel. And so I think that there's multiple layers of transition here that that I was able to appreciate through this reading.
It's beautiful. So one of our jobs as readers is to recognize that there are many voices within the text. And one of our responsibilities is to bring forward voices that may be subsurface, but they're there nevertheless, voices that have either been suppressed or voices that haven't been amplified enough. And we as readers can give amplification to those voices. And that's what I think you're suggesting with the story of Miriam, is that, oh, let's pause over this for a moment and recognize how critical she was to the survival of the Israelite community, and give her voice more amplification, and remember what happened at the crossing of the sea and the song that she and the women sang. So thank you so much. Let me invite Mark Thompson, and then Justin.
This discussion has been very helpful. It's given me a broader understanding. I have to admit that in the past, this particular portion has always bothered me, because I get the feeling that God is not a loving God in this portion. And God is unambiguous. God has no tolerance for ambiguity. And I always feel badly for Moses in this portion, because it occurs to me that in the previous chapter, he's been the subject of derision and revolt. And here again, his people are rebelling against him. Not only that, he's just lost his sister Miriam. And as you say, how are they going to get water? He's also going to lose his brother Aaron. So God, who is all-knowing, doesn't reveal compassion for his servant Moses for this one abrogation of God's edicts. And he doesn't provide a very creative solution to the problem. So I'm getting something a little bit different from this discussion. I'm seeing that it's part of a process, and still the idea that God could have not punished Moses, could have allowed him to die a natural death. What difference would that have made in the progression of the story?
Or to think about what would the effect on the Israelite people have been for Moses to have said, for Moses to have led them into the promised land.
Yeah.
Maybe as Marty was hinting at, maybe that would have been a frustration of their development for the one who led them out of Egypt to also be the one to lead them into the promised land, and then the people would never grow up. And it in some ways is a parallel there to the message about the Garden of Eden, which is, what are you doing? Just lying around eating all the grapes? Come on, you gotta be a participant in all this. You gotta get up and go out and get a job. Okay, so in the same way as Marty was hinting at, there are messages throughout Torah about this is all about human development and what it means to be a fully developed human being, which is you can't lie around just staying in your parents' basement and receiving their food that they earn a living to provide you with. You got to get up and you got to take some responsibility. So that's kind of one of the underlying themes, I think, throughout Torah. But let me call on Justin. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Rabbi. And I was nodding approval of Mark's questioning. It was really good and inspiring to hear his question there. I wanted to just mention, just as Dave has these red heifers behind him, that there's this, that's a heavy beast to consume. I take it that it was, for more than, but for any instance of being in contact with death, which is constantly happening. It's part of this process. But I just was really amazed by the idea that an entire heifer is consumed in creating this purification process. And I don't know if there's anything to comment on that, or if that's enough in itself.
Well, it also strikes me, why is this episode about the red heifer, why is it happening right now? Why didn't it happen chapters earlier? Why doesn't it happen chapters later? Because so much death is happening at this point in the story, right? Just last chapter, we had the story of Korah and hundreds of people that were drawn down into the bowels of the earth, those who died from the plague, and now we're going to be encountering the death of Aaron and Miriam, and in a sense, we're going to have the acknowledgement that Moses his leadership is going to die, and he won't be joining them. There's so much loss and death here that it seems like an appropriate place to have, we need a ritual to move through death, okay? And what it does, we can kind of look with some skepticism and about what is all this thing about you take the heifer and you burn it and you make these ashes, but what it does is it challenges us to say, okay, what's your protocol? What's your ritual for dealing with loss and death? How do you manage to go back into the requirements, responsibilities that life is all about, and not succumb to the abyss of death? What do you do? So I think it's a very profound segment in our Torah portion, and thank you for pointing it out. Thank you. Let me call upon David and Susan and then Robert. And then Paul. Okay, sorry, Paul. Yeah. David and Susan.
I'd like to pursue the point of my fellow Apikoros, Mark Thompson, on the excessive punishment of Moses. And of course, the first time I read this in Torah study years ago, also struck by what seemed to be not a proportionate punishment for the behavior. And we have discussed before, and this time, how it's really appropriate at this time for Moses and Aaron and Miriam to be dying, because to enter the promised land, the people need to go to the yoke of leadership more diffusely. They need to give up on their great leaders that could have turned into idols, etc. However, that is not an answer to, that's not a satisfactory answer to the statement Moses was punished for striking the rock by being prevented from going into the promised land. He could have been prevented from going into the promised land, which seems a horrible punishment for bad behavior, in a way that said, well, this is the end of his journey. The loss of your idolized leadership at the end of this 40-year mythological journey that we and personally go through needs to come to a stop. But it seems to me it's almost like God looked for an excuse. I mean, Aaron was able to die, and Miriam were able to die without it being a punishment. So I needed more nuanced answer.
So here's what I thought about while you were kind of opening up this line of really important thinking. To go back to how we opened up our study sheet, what Moses is being criticized for was what's called lack of faith. And we went through a little bit of study about what exactly is faith. Is faith just like blind obedience? No, that's not what the nuance of faith is in Judaism. Faith, as we work it through, is an expression of innovation, interpretation, and creativity. It uses tradition, as our artist here does, uses tradition as one of the media with which to create something. But at its essence, faith is an act of artistry. Okay. Now, having said that, the particular act that Moses in this story is being critiqued for is for hitting the rock, not speaking to it. And what happens is, if you remember, there's a prior incident where Moses, in an earlier chapter, speaks to a rock, hits a rock with his staff, and water comes out. In this later story, God says, speak to the rock and water will come out. And Moses reverts back to an old way of doing things. He hits the rock with the staff again. In other words, it is the absolute frustration of innovation. He is repeating an old way. He is not opening up the way this divine voice wants him to be a model of innovation, if you will. And so it is because he is not fulfilling what is at this point this critical skill, which is to be innovative. When you enter into the promised land, you need to be innovative. You can't just keep repeating what's been done before. And so that's the critique that's happening here. This is a work of art. This is a work of art that we're looking at, right? It's not a history. It's a work of art. And so the message about the importance of innovation and of teaching people the importance of innovation is being painted for us in a picture having to do with Moses hitting a rock instead of speaking to it, and a voice saying, that's it. That's the end of it. You're not fit to, you're not the appropriate voice to lead the people into the next stage of their life, which, as the Hamak Devar says, has to do with, as he says, it is going beyond the miracles and the divine intervention. It has to, they're now need to go into the human work of study, prayer, and decision making. Okay. And so that's the way I read why the image is being painted this way about Moses and the rock and not being able to go in. Thank you, David. As always, you opened up wonderful veins of thought. And let me invite Paul and then Robert, okay? Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I just want to add to Gary's comment, and also connected to your comment too. In Hebrew, they have the word chukim and mishpatim, which is the give an example of chukim was I was in the Air Force and I had to wear a blue uniform. I couldn't talk about Scotch plaid or polka dots. It was blue. So that was the chukim. But now when it comes to the mishpatim, like if somebody puts a vessel in the middle of the street and somebody trips on it. Okay, so now comes all kinds of commentary, page upon page of all the different conditions and how it leads to different conclusions. And then if that's not enough for you, on the side pages, there's other people that come later that give in even more interpretations. So that's the mishpatim. That's not the doctrine. It's all the stuff that the rabbi and yourself were talking about.
I never heard about those two words being described that way, about a blue uniform and about, So yes, there are some things that don't make any sense, but that's the way it is. So let me just call upon Robert, then I'm going to call upon Richard here. Go ahead, Robert.
Thank you. Once again, a lovely, lovely evening with so many insightful comments. I was really struck, Catherine, by your comment of paving the way. And I think Miriam was paving the way and represented a milestone for the progress of women. Every great religion has had an outstanding woman that was instrumental in maintaining the faith of the flock. But I think it also paved the way for women to realize that they had a place, although womanhood has been held back until about the middle of the 1800s. It was very seriously held back. Some parts of the world it still is. To Justin's comment, the heifers we have today have been breeded over millennia to be very big. But in those days, I suspect they were much smaller. Now, the people were smaller, so it probably worked out the same. It's very interesting, this part of Moses. I look at it this way. Moses was the one that was the interlocutor, the one that God spoke through. Obviously, he had a deep love for Moses. And I would say that the Israelites, time and time again, did not obey Moses, which means they did not obey God. They still didn't get the message. So he used Moses as an example and to awaken them to realize that there is no latitude to disobedience. And, there's a balance in our lives. Certain things we must obey, certain things we have to use judgment on, etc. The last comment I want to make is that the Holy Land was with them, I believe, all the time. And that Holy Land was Moses. And it was his laws, his wisdom, his understanding. And I think a proof of that is during the Ottoman Empire, there were 1,200 years that the Jews could not go back to Israel, but they still had Moses and they still had the Holy Book. So what I'm saying is there's such a wide way to look at this, and I've really enjoyed all the comments. Always a stimulating evening.
Thank you, Robert, as always. Thank you so much. And Richard?
Yes, I wanted to say a little bit about the red heifer, and I don't think it's a red herring. That it's an innovation. It's much different than ever before. There's no pleasing order to the Lord. It takes place outside the camp. It's burnt outside the camp. Its ashes are disposed of outside of the camp. And all it is about is reminding us that if you touch something dead, you're going to get the pox or whatever it is. You got to be aware we're all mortal here. So we have all this cleanliness because that's what you're going to go with into the new land. You're not going to have a priest anymore. You're not going to have a gentleman anymore, that you an authority that you can badger with. You have to do it yourself. And you've got to have a ritual. And your ritual is going to be about honoring death and honoring cleanliness as you go into the new land. So I see it as a patch on this patchwork quilt ship out here.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Richard. So let me wrap this up for this evening by saying, this Torah portion paints a picture of the Israelites encountering perhaps their greatest shock to their system yet, which is they've been traveling, they've been provided water through the grace of Miriam, they have been led in religious ritual by Aaron, they've been led as a matter of political leadership by Moses, and all of that comes to an end in this Torah portion. And they are now faced, and the people are faced with this shock. What are we going to do? Turn back, give up, grow up, go forward. And at least in this moment, they choose to assume the responsibility that at once had been carried by these three leaders. They sing a song, and they're singing a song which is, in a sense, what the priest did. The priest was a conveyor of song. So they sing a song, but they displace the priest. They bring forth water, they displace Miriam. They send messengers to an enemy king and say, get out of our way, we're coming through. And they defeat the king. They displace the political leadership, at least for this moment. They rise up and they become more actualized, well-developed human beings, which is what is required if they're going to settle a land of promise. I'm so grateful to be part of a community of interpreters, a community of interpretation, the faith of interpretation, knowing that it is interpretation rather than mere doctrine that will get us through to a higher realm. God bless you all. I look forward to our next gathering. Be well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Mark, I'll call.